We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant.
That was Philip K. Dick in 1977, describing the Matrix at a public conference long before the movie came out. And certainly all the other ideas popular today that point that the Hinduism concept of the Leela, that is, the playful game that is creation, is actually one eternal computer video game that is less than benign, that we gotta finish, battle in the end the mighty boss that is the Demiurge, or Yaldabaoth, or Yaldibaldi as I often call him. And he is our personal and cosmic ego. And if we lose, we get to start all the way back at level 1, our accomplishments erased and wallowing in karmic ignorance. And our very divine spark fuels this eternal computer video game. We must gain the gnosis to not just understand that we're both the player and the main character, but that we are meant to get out of the entire suburban-like arcade that is the multiverse.
Greetings. The Master Control Program has chosen you to serve your system on the game grid.
That's the message of the Gnostics, thousands of years ago and now. And we gather to remember this at the virtual Alexandria for the latest episode of Schrodinger's Diary on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio with Anthony Peake and Astral guest Martin Ball. Broadcast as always through the God Above God Dad Kim.
Hey, what'd you do to the world?
Turned it off.
It's pure heresy, my beloved true seekers. But heresy shouldn't be this much fun. But it just is. It just is. Especially when we've more than exposed this computer video game built by the sensationalistic vagaries of a demented god and his slaves in the establishment. And more than exposed our buried divine spark that is so full of supernova reason, art, kindness, and curiosity. We're done being the Mario or Master Chief or Laura Croft for the joy of hating angels, ready to accept we tower above the consoles of the powers and principalities.
If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe.
And how do we get out? By realizing we are still at level 1, and that is rock bottom. After all, how do you know you've even hit rock bottom? That's easy. You finally stop digging. We're done digging, and we're looking up beyond the false gaming levels and pixel life bit illusions, all the way to the pleroma, or the fullness of the real divinity. And we will be enjoined to it. The game has been rigged since before creation, making us each a sleeping Tron, tormented with bad plot nightmares of materialism, anxiety, envy, and Ozymandias flashing gold coins. As my friend Jim West says, if you really want to escape from this worldly prison, then stop pretending that you're not behind bars.
Freedom is life's great lie. Once you accept that, in your heart, you will know peace.
We are trapped in never-ending Sims or Elder Scrolls, the black iron prison Philip K. Dick wrote about. And the only solution is to write our own gospel and live our own myths. die and resurrect as Aeonic dungeon masters while still in the computer video game, in order to gain the nous or higher mind, as Socrates says in the Credo and the classic Gnostics advise.
I thought it wasn't real.
Your mind makes it real.
If you're killed in the Matrix, you die here?
The body cannot live without the mind.
Or, bringing in Philip K. Dick again, he said, "The great confrontation worthy of man is between tragedy, that is, the classic and Greek victory by fate over man, and the heroic, that is, modern and Faustian, the victory of man over fate. And this is achieved by collapsing time and space and meeting death now, on your own terms, seizing it, not it you. You die, but it is your death, not death imposed on you in violation of your nature. It's logical outcome of what you are, not what world and fate are."
I'm sorry? What was that again?
I'm a god.
You're God.
I'm a god. I'm not the god. I don't think.
And Dick further pointed out in another great quote, "The true measure of man is not his intelligence, or how high he rises in this freak establishment. No, the true measure of man is this: how quickly can he respond to the needs of others, and how much of himself he can give. No single thing abides. All things are fucked up. A man is an angel that has gone deranged."
I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith.
I am Abraxas in his mortal incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting from the lawful dystopia Chicago. I am your Pompidus of Gnosis, waking up your inner modern-day Tom Sawyer, your mind not for rent by any god or government. My task, to put it simply, is as Carl Jung once said, and that is, show me a sane man, and I will cure him for you. And as the great Robert Anton Wilson said, of course I'm crazy, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong.
Well, I've wrestled with reality for 35 years, Doctor, and I'm happy to state I finally won out over it.
Yes, too many sane people on this ship of fools we call the world. Sane with the psychosis that is normality. Always fearful of the harpies of societal approval. And trapped in that sanity numbers fallacy. Or as Evelyn Underhill once said, sanity consists in sharing the hallucinations of our neighbors.
Christoph, let me ask you, why do you think that Truman has never come close to discovering the true nature of his world until now?
We accept the reality of the world with which we're presented. It's as simple as that.
As mentioned, before I got carried away in my Logoria ranting, this is an edition of Schrodinger's Diary on this May 4th, the year of our Demiurge 2013. Schrodinger's Diary is our ongoing chronicle of Anthony's Cheating the Ferryman Hypothesis. Here we are, seemingly trapped in labyrinths of myriad realities, eternally reoccurring and eternally begetting, reincarnated and recycled in a vast universe. But there is hope to escape the black iron prison if we find a way to not board Karen's boat this one time outside of time. The cat is out of the bag, the box of time and space, dead and alive, and we're getting out with him. And the cat has probably realized this is a computer video game constructed by Jehovah and his archons.
It's all true. It's all real. Nothing here is fake. Nothing you see on this show is fake. It's merely controlled.
For more information on Anthony, a great game hacker of reality and friend of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, on his stellar books and projects, please visit AnthonyPeake.com. That is Peake. And check out Aeon Byte's iTunes, main player, and YouTube for past episodes of Schrodinger's Diary with some of the great mystics and heretics of our era.
Devils, blasphemers, pray to your heathen god, while in the Lord's name we cast you out.
Anthony and yours falsely definitely have the pleasure of being joined by the sage Martin Ball to discuss the entheological paradigm. Yes, it's a heavy dose of shamanism, technosis, landscapes of forbidden faiths, and so much more that really fits in well with the ethos of Schrodinger's Diary. Martin, beyond being one of today's leading esoteric ninjas, is the author of several compelling books, including Mushroom Wisdom, All Is One, and Being Human. He is professor of religious studies at Southern Oregon University, as well as an accomplished fiction writer, visionary artist, and musician. A truly Renaissance man in a world of Pong gurus and New Age Donkey Kongs. For more information on Martin, please visit martinball.net.
This is news to me. I never knew farmers smoked weed.
You ever try farming not high? It's boring as shit.
So, getting away from my other bad analogies and metaphors, put on your seatbelts of blasphemy, lock up your daughters of orthodoxy, and hide the children of your insecurity, because we're going on a ride that will lead you to the greatest and most important journey you'll ever take. Finding out who you really are and what reality is really not.
People that talk in metaphors ought to shampoo my crotch.
Or as the Gospel of Thomas tells us, when you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are poverty. Or, as the Book of Thomas the Contender says from the Nag Hammadi Library, blessed are you who have prior knowledge of the stumbling blocks and who flee alien things.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. One way to do this is to use our site's Amazon links for really any purchase, as I get a small kickback. Donations or any type of assistance are always a blessing, even if it's the many skills I don't have, like web design or marketing or virgin sacrifices. I truly appreciate you Super Saiyans who support this Hobbit podcast via donations, buying products like me books, or downloading shows. I'd like to give a shout out to such true seeker warriors who support this venture every week, like Brenda, Augustine, Matthew, Derek, Chris L., Michael A., Paul M., the boys at Mythicist Milwaukee, and so many others. I truly appreciate your wisdom and shekels.
You make me happy.
But enough of my drivel. Let's cure some more sane people and get out of this cosmic grand theft auto. It's Schrodinger's Diary with the great Anthony Peake and the sapient Martin Ball. This is a special episode of Schrodinger's Diary, where Anthony Peake and your host Miguel Connor explore the inner and outer realities of the Pleroma and the Kenoma. And with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Martin Ball. How are you doing, Martin?
I'm doing quite excellent. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today.
How are you, Anthony?
I'm fine. I'm really delighted to get Schrodinger's Diary back on track again. So, it's really great to be linking up with you again, Miguel.
As always, Anthony. All right, Anthony, do you want to get started?
I certainly will. Just to explain to the audience a little bit about how I came across Martin's work. I've been, since I last did one of these broadcasts, I've written a book called The Infinite Minefield. And in The Infinite Minefield, I'm discussing a substance called dimethyltryptamine. I'm discussing the pineal gland, the role of the pineal gland, and the role of the possibility that the human brain can excrete endogenously, that is internally, dimethyltryptamine. And in the course of my research, I came across Martin's book, The Entheological Paradigm, and it literally blew me away, because what this book was saying was a great deal of where I had been going with my own thoughts for some period of time. Now, what also hit me very, very strongly was the Gnostic aspects of the worldview that Martin puts together in his absolutely incredible book. And I'm hoping now, for the next hour or so, we're going to get really deeply into Martin's concept of the entheological paradigm. So without further ado, Martin, what is the entheological paradigm? Why did you create it? And how did it come about?
The answers to all those questions are a bit extended, so I'll see what I can do to kind of encapsulate here. But to sum it up, what I would say is that the entheological paradigm is looking to kind of reframe our sense of what it means to be human, what is the nature of reality, and what are the possible ranges of human consciousness and human sense of identity. And I came about creating this paradigm as a result of my personal experiences with various entheogens, primarily with 5-MeO-DMT. And in going through these experiences myself, what I found is that the models that I had learned about the nature of being and the nature of reality, didn't quite fit with my own personal experiences that I was undergoing. So I have my PhD in religious studies, and my areas in religious studies were comparative mysticism, comparative shamanism, philosophy of science and religion, and also an emphasis on Native American traditions. So I developed quite a bit of book knowledge about a variety of different positions on what is the nature of the self, what is the nature of being, what is the nature of the ego, how do we transcend the ego, and then what is revealed through the transcendence of the ego, and what is the ultimate nature of reality that then comes about as a result of what we might call mystical experiences. So I understood all of this at a very intellectual kind of academic level. And through my work with 5-MeO-DMT, which we talked about on your show a couple weeks ago, that I found that none of these models that I was working from, and I would say primarily as a mystical model, I was working from Buddhism, and I had considered myself a practicing Buddhist for a number of years, primarily Zen Buddhism, and also I was very familiar with many different shamanic models of nature of consciousness, nature of reality, and nature of being. But what I found in these experiences that I was undergoing, that none of those models really fit what I was experiencing myself. And what a primary problem that was arising was that I found that describing these experiences as spiritual or as a spiritual problem really didn't fit what it was that I was experiencing, where it was primarily what I would describe as an energetic issue. It was an issue of energy in terms of what is the nature of the ego, how do we transcend the ego, and then what is revealed when that transcendence occurs. So I went about the task of creating my own model of reframing this issue from, quote, a spiritual or metaphysical issue into an energetic issue, which I can go into more detail later about exactly what I mean by that. And so then articulating this idea of the entheological paradigm. In my own experiences, not only did I find that other models were just not quite accurate for what it was that I was undergoing, but in developing my own model through my own experiences, I also found that a number of things that were claimed by various spiritual traditions I could no longer fundamentally agree with, that I found that there were a number of problems. Again, coming from more of a Buddhist background, there was a number of issues there that I found that I could no longer support. For example, ideas of reincarnation. I found that just really wasn't an accurate depiction of the nature of the self, which also means that karma, which is tied into theories of reincarnation, also didn't seem to apply. So I created this new model of the entheological paradigm, and as we've discussed previously, the idea of entheological comes from the word entheogen, which is a substitute term for psychedelics or hallucinogens. And entheogen comes from the Greek, and it means generating the experience of God within. So entheological paradigm means a model of reality that is based on the idea of God within. And also, as we discussed previously, that's a little bit of a misnomer, because when I'm talking about God as a singular entity or being, that this is both within and without and everywhere in between. So this is an all-encompassing sense of reality or identity or being. But entheological is important because it's something that is discovered within. It's by going within that we're able to see this about ourselves and our own experience, and that is primarily based on an experiential model of coming to know the self. So that in that sense, it kind of fits a Gnostic or mystical model. So in a very brief nutshell, that's what it's about.
One of the things that I'd be interested to discuss with you, because I'm sure the audience out there are probably aware of dimethyltryptamine as a substance, but what are the technical differences between DMT and 5-MeO-DMT? And in your opinion, what is the qualitative difference between the different experiences? What is it that's special about 5-MeO-DMT?
Yeah, so first of all, dimethyltryptamine or 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, these fit into a class of molecules that are called tryptamines. And even though it sounds like, oh, maybe that's hippie language because it's trippy, it's not. It's a different linguistic formulation of tryptamine. The tryptamine is a particular kind of molecule that has a very particular molecular structure. And neuroscientists and biologists have determined that our primary neurotransmitters that operate within the human body, such as serotonin, fits into this category of a tryptamine molecule that has this particular molecular structure. And then we also have melatonin, which is produced by the pineal gland, which regulates our sense of time and is related to our physiological functions in connection with periods of light and darkness. And in addition to these primary neurotransmitters, and sometimes people call them hormones that operate within the human body, we have some other very interesting tryptamines, such as dimethyltryptamine and 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine. Now, when these were first discovered inside human beings, this was really quite a surprise to biologists and neuroscientists, because these two molecules are also classified as very powerful hallucinogenic substances. And in fact, when we look at a variety of what we can call hallucinogenic plants or psychedelic plants and mushrooms or entheogenic plants and mushrooms around the world, what we see is that there tend to be variations of these two molecules in many of these different kinds of plants and fungi. So for example, when we're talking about what are called magic mushrooms, which most often are species of psilocybin mushrooms. Psilocybin and psilocin, the active compounds within those mushrooms, are variations of the dimethyltryptamine molecule. So these are classified as tryptamine hallucinogens or tryptamine psychedelics. Also, when we look at ayahuasca, which is this traditional drink that's made by indigenous cultures in the Amazon, the active ingredient that is included into that drink is dimethyltryptamine. And most often that's coming from the Psychotria viridis plant, where they take the leaves from this plant and then they mix it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And that's what produces the psychedelic brew of ayahuasca. And then sometimes also other plants are used in ayahuasca, which contain 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine. So these are substances that have been taken by various cultures for many thousands of years to produce altered states of consciousness, and for mystical purposes as well as for shamanic purposes. And we now know through anthropology and through religious studies that many cultures around the world have made use of mind-altering substances as part of their sacred rituals and part of their religious practice. We see this in India. We can see this in the Middle East. We can see this in Europe. We can see this in South America. We can see this in Central America. We can see this in North America. So really, it's something that's a very ancient heritage among human beings. And in fact, the oldest religious scriptures in the world, the Hindu Vedas, in the Rig Veda, there are numerous hymns to this god Soma. There's also references to Soma to being some kind of plant, which is not mentioned in the text, but this is a very ancient reference to the use of psychedelic plants and fungi in religious practice and experience. And in the Vedas, this is where we get the fundamental formulation within Hinduism that Atman is Brahman, or the individual self actually is the unitary nature of consciousness of reality, which is Brahman. So we can see a tie-in between psychedelics and mystical states of consciousness going back many thousands of years in human cultures. So to get back to the idea that this was quite a surprise when neuroscientists realized, well, these molecules, these very powerful molecules, actually are present inside each and every human being on the planet. And not only that, it was also discovered that DMT and 5-MeO-DMT are present in all mammals. And in addition to that, the precursors to DMT and 5-MeO-DMT are found in countless insects, many different forms of life, plants, all kinds of things. And not only are the precursors there, but many plants also contain DMT and 5-MeO-DMT. So these molecules seem to be fairly ubiquitous throughout nature. But scientists have not really been able to come to a determination of exactly, well, what are these molecules doing inside these living beings? What is their function? For example, in some plants, DMT and 5-MeO-DMT seem to function as natural pest control, that some species of bugs might try and eat those plants, and those tryptamines are actually going to be kind of a poison to those individuals. But with human beings, our bodies are actually primed to process these molecules. And so DMT and 5-MeO-DMT are part of a very small class of molecules that immediately cross the blood-brain barrier. Now, if we ingest these molecules by eating them, it's particularly DMT and 5-MeO-DMT, we have enzymes in our stomach that break these molecules down very quickly. So we're actually not able to get an effect by eating them unless we also take what's called a monoamine oxidase inhibitor with them at the same time. And just at a general speculation, it could be that our bodies function this way because, again, all mammals have DMT and 5-MeO-DMT inside them. And so as meat eaters, perhaps, and also given that it's in a number of different plants, so also as herbivores, that perhaps our bodies function this way so that we're not tripping every time we go out and try and eat something, because these molecules are in so many different things in nature. But if we take them with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, such as in ayahuasca, or if it's in a slightly different form, such as psilocin or psilocybin in psychedelic mushrooms, then we're able to ingest those, and then the molecule is able to actually function within our bodies. Or it can be snorted, or it can be smoked, or you can even take an enema if that's something that you choose to do, because it can be absorbed through mucous membranes. So that's a little bit about these two molecules and what we know about them scientifically. But in terms of experiential effects, which is what Anthony asked about, if it's taken in the form of, say, ayahuasca, DMT and 5-MeO-DMT takes anywhere from 30 minutes to about an hour for the effect to come on, which many psychedelic users kind of understand that that's sort of a normal time period for a psychedelic to have the onset period before it really begins to take effect. And then the ayahuasca experience, depending on how the brew is made, can last anywhere from a couple hours to maybe 5 or even more hours. And also, for example, with psilocybin mushrooms, typical effects last from like 5, 6 to 7 hours at the longest generally. Now, if these molecules are smoked, which is how they're often ingested in the West, that many Westerners, rather than making ayahuasca, which is becoming increasingly popular, but many people enjoy making extracts of these molecules and then smoking them. Because when you do that, their onset is merely a matter of seconds. It's almost instantaneous. So to do a very brief comparison between these two molecules, if someone smokes DMT, it will come on within a matter of seconds. And both DMT and 5-MeO-DMT have kind of a threshold amount. So there's kind of two different categories of experiences that we could describe here. There's kind of the non-release dose, and then there's the release dose. So first I'll kind of mention what the non-release dose is. And that's where you might smoke DMT or 5-MeO-DMT and things might get rather psychedelic, but you still have this strong sense that your ego is in place, that there's still this normal sense of self that's operating, and things just become very psychedelic very quickly. The release dose is generally a larger amount of these extracts, and what happens is the energy of the experience becomes so intense and so overwhelming that people often describe themselves as feeling that they're losing their normal sense of self and they're entering into a fully psychedelic reality that seems for many people to be beyond the normal material realm. And so it's not just that you're having this sub-release dose where maybe things are trippy and very geometrical and very bright and colorful, but that you enter into a fully articulated psychedelic reality where you might be completely unaware of where you are physically at that time. And this is also when people start to report very intense, what we might call spiritual experiences. So again, to get back to the comparison, if we have a full release dose of DMT, that usually only lasts between 5 and 15 minutes long, and it comes on in a matter of seconds. It very quickly escalates into a very intense experience, and it tends to be very visual. Particularly DMT is very bright. One of the ways I describe it is that DMT is like bright neon lights that are fractaled out into these very intricate geometric patterns that just becomes your entire sense of reality, is these fractaled out patterns of very bright, very beautiful geometry. 5-MeO-DMT is actually far more powerful than DMT itself, but it tends to be less visual. So DMT has become much more popular in Western countercultural circles because it's very psychedelic. Like if we go back to Terence McKenna, one of the things that he said, he didn't have a lot to say about 5-MeO-DMT, but one of the things that he said was, well, I don't really hallucinate on 5-MeO-DMT, so I want to talk about DMT because I really hallucinate a lot, and that's really interesting. So he was really I would say overly focused on the visual nature of DMT, and for him that was what the fascination was. And many people also feel the same way, that they enjoy that visual nature of DMT. And even people who are comfortable with DMT are scared to death by 5-MeO-DMT because it's so much stronger and because it doesn't tend to have this visual component to it. Some people describe it as entering the void, where it's a extremely altered state of consciousness, but there might not be any content to it, which tends to scare some people. But it also can be very visual, but when it is visual, I would describe it as more like pure white light refracted through an extremely intricate crystal prism. So if you can kind of imagine white light that sort of rainbows out into these amazing mandala fractal forms, that's kind of the visual nature of 5-MeO-DMT. But as tryptamines, they're kind of part of the same family, so that there are many similarities in terms of the fractal geometric structure of what you see and what you experience and what you feel. But what's really significant about the difference between 5-MeO-DMT and DMT is that with DMT, it's far more likely that your ego, even at a full release dose, it's far more likely that your ego is still going to be in play. You're still going to have a sense of me experiencing this amazing thing that's happening to me, or I'm in this other realm, or it's somewhere outside of me. Whereas with 5-MeO-DMT, you are far more likely to have what I would call full ego transcendence. and enter into a full mystical state of consciousness, which I would describe as the sense of unitary being, unitary consciousness, and infinite connection to everything. And that's where I would describe that people are able to experience themselves in their true nature or their true self, which is this unitary being of consciousness and energy, which for that I use the word God because I feel that's very appropriate. So to really quickly sum up, you're far more likely to experience the true nature of the self as God with 5-MeO-DMT than you are with DMT. And also 5-MeO-DMT, a full release dose, lasts more between 20 and 40 minutes, where again DMT is more like 5 to 15 or maybe 20 minutes at the most.
Well, thank you for that. That was excellent. And I know that it was going slightly off where we were planning to go, but I think it's important that the listeners out there realize the differences here. Because what we're talking about here, as I understand it, and it's very, very radical non-dualism. Now, we have the non-dualism that we actually have in Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, but your kind of non-dualism is far more profound than that, isn't it? You're actually, could you explain exactly, the subtle differences between your non-dualism and the non-dualism that's put forward by the traditional Eastern religions?
This is actually a very important point for where I felt the need to articulate the entheological paradigm, because I found that through my own experiences, again, that the model I was getting from Hinduism or from Buddhism, it just didn't work for me. It actually didn't make any sense. And so that's why I tend to describe my position as radical non-dualism, because within Hinduism, there's, for example, Advaita Vedanta, which it's in the name, non-dualism. Advaita means non-dual. And Buddhism also describes itself as a non-dual tradition. And I would also describe my own experiences and my own paradigm as being non-dual. And by non-dual, what I mean is that generally from the position of the ego, what we're doing is we're dividing reality between what we say is the self and what we say is not the self. So for example, from the average standard position that we're operating from here, we've got this guy named Martin, and he's the one speaking right now, and he's speaking to Anthony, and he's speaking to Miguel, and these are all different people. And so the self that is Martin is different from the self that is Anthony, or is different from the self that is anyone who's listening to this interview. So that's kind of a standard dualistic position. And it also means that Martin is different from the microphone that he's speaking into. He's different from the computer that's recording his voice and is transmitting these messages. And the non-dual position is the idea that these separations that we're making between what we're saying is the self and what we're saying is the other is really a fabrication of the human ego. It's a fabrication of our individualized sense of self, but that it's not accurate. It's not a reflection of reality. So in Buddhism, they describe the dualist position as being based fundamentally on ignorance, that we develop an ignorant sense of who we think we are. And that's why meditation is such an important program within Buddhism, because through meditation, you are able to analyze your sense of self. And so like in Vipassana meditation as developed by the Buddha, and this was really radical for the Buddha, because in Hinduism, you have the notion of the Atman is Brahman. So even in their non-dual traditions, they say that you have a soul, you are a soul that is Atman. And that different people have different individual souls, but that soul actually is Brahman. It actually is the unitary nature of being. Something that was radical about what the Buddha did is Buddha said, well, through my Vipassana meditation, through my careful analysis of myself, Buddha said, there actually is no self. So he came up with the position of anatta or anatman, saying that there actually isn't a soul, that souls don't exist, that this itself is a figment of the imagination of the ego. And he was really kind of a countercultural movement within ancient Indian society. So he was reacting to a lot of things that were taking place within Brahmanical Hinduism. But even in Buddhism, Buddha rejects the notion of the soul, But Buddhism still holds on to ideas of individual reincarnation and then the influence of karma, which comes out of the Vedic traditions within India. So from my position, what I see going on in Buddhism is that Buddha is actually not going far enough. He rejects the notion of the individual soul, but he keeps the idea of personal incarnation or reincarnation, which is governed by the law of karma, which now he's redefining these terms of karma and reincarnation out of the Hindu context, but he's still recreating them within the Buddhist context. My radical non-dualism goes further than that, because my claim is that we are all this one unitary consciousness, the non-dual position. And when I realized that this was the true nature of myself, the notion of personal reincarnation became, for me, a pure projection of the ego and a holdover of the ego, because the ego wants to maintain a sense of personal identity. And it likes to project that idea that, oh, well, I have a series of incarnations. So maybe I'm not really Martin, but maybe I'm this stream of consciousness that is incarnating through different lives, and that I'm affected by this process called karma. So I need to be concerned about karma and how I'm behaving ethically, because that's going to affect my karma. But from my radical non-dualist position, the notion of individual streams or consciousness or individual souls just becomes meaningless, because if I am the unitary consciousness that is all things, that means that I'm actually my true nature. And I'm not talking about Martin, because Martin is just the character that I'm playing from this particular body. I'm talking about the true nature of the self, the unitary nature of the self, means that I am all beings right now. And I am all beings that have ever lived, and I am all beings that will ever be. So that is a far more inclusive sense of identity. And so then rather than seeing individual trajectories of manifestations of individual lives through space and time, kind of this linear progression, which in Hinduism and Buddhism are characterized as an evolution of individualized consciousness, I completely reject that notion. I don't see the possibility for individual consciousness being incarnated across multiple lives, because it's actually all one unitary consciousness. So one way I describe this, which we talked about in the previous show that we did, is that God is the actor that's playing all the characters of reality simultaneously. And underneath the vast diversity of everything that we experience within reality, there's only one actor. And when you get down to the core of each of the different characters' true sense of self and individuality, that is this one actor. So that's why I describe my non-dualism as being radical, because I actually reject many of the primary propositions of the Buddha, and I reject many of the primary propositions of other non-dual traditions, that I don't see reincarnation as a legitimate issue, because that's just not the nature of the self. So I feel that my position actually goes quite a bit further than what the Buddha was willing to state. And another possibility I will add is that it's quite possible, because the Buddha did talk about anatta and anatman, that it's possible that his later followers, because when people asked him, well, is there a soul? What happens after death? Reportedly, the Buddha said, look, answering those questions are not going to help you reach enlightenment. It's possible that ideas of reincarnation and karma were kind of reintroduced into his teachings by his followers, because it was such a fundamental assumption of Indian culture.
Martin, I certainly agree with you, and that's very interesting what you've been saying, especially in the context of ignorance, because after all, the Gnostics, specifically in the Gospel of Philip, talks about ignorance is the greatest of sins, and gnosis is the way out. And I certainly agree with you about Buddhism, because after all, Buddha was a reformer, and one of the main problems with reincarnation is that it still keeps the caste system, which is something Buddha wanted to get rid of, and it still lingers today. But going more towards the experience you were talking about, and tying it more to the Gnostics have been accused of being these like Sartre world haters. And what it seems to me what they were doing is they were simply taking the red pill and confronting the ego and the projection the ego had placed on the world. And in your book, Mushroom Wisdom, you talk about how when the ego begins to dissolve or struggles, you get these near-death experiences, this sort of internal violence. Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah, that this is a big part of what I've been looking to articulate through the entheological paradigm is to really analyze, well, what is going on when people are having psychedelic experiences, and also including spiritual experiences that are not connected to psychedelics and meditation experiences. So kind of asking the question, what's happening as people are having these very powerful experiences? And it's important to recognize that when either through the use of entheogens or not through the use of entheogens, that it's actually very common for people to have experiences of other realms, of other entities, of feeling that maybe they're going to heaven or they're going to hell, or that they're having all different kinds of variety of experiences, and that there might be many different beings there that are identified as other or alien or as spiritual. So these are part of the experiences that people have. But what I've done with the entheological paradigm is describe how these really are projections of the ego, where what's happening is we are entering into a highly amplified energetic state. And so this is where I'm going back to saying that through the entheological paradigm, I'm looking to reframe the issue from a spiritual issue to an energetic issue. So when we're consuming entheogens, what's happening is that we're having this very powerful energetic experience. I mean, people describe it as feeling that they are expanding, or that energy is rising, or that energy is moving, or that vibrations are fluctuating. So it's a very common way of describing these kinds of things. And also when we look at many mystical traditions, they talk about tapping into the subtle energies of our mind and our body and manipulating these energies in order to produce altered states of consciousness and transcendent states of consciousness. So what's going on is, I like to describe the ego as a collection of limited energetic patterns that are set up very dualistically, that make divides between what we want to identify as and what we want to say is other or not the self. And collectively, these patterns create our sense of self through our thoughts, our actions, our gestures, and they're all ways that we actualize, mobilize, and express energy through our being. So our thoughts are energy. Our tone of voice is energy. The way that we use our bodies to move through reality or to hold ourselves, those are all expressions of energy. And collectively, they comprise our sense of self, of who it is that we think we are. And this is something that we create for ourselves as we're developing as human beings, from the time that we're very small children to as we're coming into adulthood and going through different identity changes. Now, the energy that's opening up in deep meditative experiences or ritual experiences or entheogenic experiences is this energy is starting to rise and expand. And like with 5-MeO-DMT, it's expanding very, very quickly, very, very rapidly, and very, very powerfully. And the ego has a couple different choices here. One is that the ego can say, look, I'm expanding, my sense of identity is dissolving. And from the perspective of the ego, the interpretation often is, oh my God, I'm dying. That the ego thinks, I'm dissolving and I'm never coming back. And the ego can say, okay, and just allow that process to happen. And when that occurs, the structural patterns of the ego can fall away, and then we can enter into a non-dual or unitary state of being and awareness. And within that state, there's no divide between subject and object, or self and other. Everything just enters into this one unitary, eternal, infinite sense of energetic being. However, in order to reach that state, the ego needs to completely trust, completely surrender, and completely let go. And it's actually very difficult for most egos to do that, because one of the jobs of the ego is to maintain itself at all costs and to use whatever energetic patterns are available to it to maintain that sense of self. And this, serves a very important purpose for self-aware human beings. So it's not that this is innately bad or that there's anything wrong with that. It's just the way that the ego functions. So if the ego is holding on to any degree, maintaining a sense of self, then what we see occur within these experiences is there is a subject that's experiencing some kind of reality that is deemed to be other or something that exists outside the self. So to go back to my book, The Entheological Paradigm, one of the essays that I wrote in that book is an analysis of the film DMT, The Spirit Molecule, which was based on the research of Dr. Rick Strassman, where he gave a number of subjects rather high doses of DMT and then recorded their experiences. And these individuals are interviewed within the film, and they recount what it was that they experienced as they went through this DMT process. And so what I do in that article is I look at all of the experiences that are recounted in the film, and I start with what I identify as the most dualistic, or as where the ego is most present. And then we get finally to the experience where one of the subject's ego completely dissolves, and then he describes how he went into this pure golden white light, and it was just all God, and he didn't have any sense of individual self there. And so that was where his ego completely dissolves. And on the other end of the spectrum, I start with this woman who says that she felt herself being shot out through her DNA and traveling across the universe and encountering different aliens and interacting with them. So I describe that as the most ego-based of the experiences. And I'm not trying to put that in a negative sense. I'm not saying she's being egotistical or arrogant or full of a sense of self-importance. I'm just saying that her ego hasn't actually let go. And when the ego is still holding on, it produces these very radical experiences where there's a strong sense of otherness within the experience, whereas the non-dual experience is a complete sense of unity. There's no otherness that exists there. So I think that we can take any spiritual experience and kind of analyze it or characterize it as either being more dualistic or more along the non-dualist or unitary range, and that there's a whole variety of things that occur within that spectrum. And so the key of gnosis, the key of self-knowledge, is careful observation to see, where am I in all this? What is the nature of what's actually going on within this experience? And so my position is that the enlightened position of full self-knowledge is recognition that you are the author of all of your experiences, and everything that you are perceiving as other is actually yourself, just in a form that it seems to be appearing outside of you in some sense, but it actually is a reflection of you. And as long as your ego is holding on, your experiences are going to reflect the fundamental patterns and assumptions of your ego. Even when things are very surprising or unusual, it's still a reflection of your ego. And that when you go beyond that, that's when you enter into the full non-dual state, and where you're able to gain genuine knowledge about the nature of the self. Rather than dealing with the projections and attachments of the ego, you're able to experience yourself in an unmediated, pure sense where there isn't this distortion that's caused by the ego in the individuated sense of self.
Martin, I can certainly relate as someone who has participated in ayahuasca rituals with the Santo Daime group in Brazil. And yes, one of the experiences they warned us, and I went through, is that sense of complete death. You feel like you're being buried and you are dead. And this certainly relates to many of the Gnostic texts, where Jesus will take the apostles, the fragments of the ego, through a journey. And instead of going immediately to the pleroma or heaven, he takes them to these horrible underworlds where there's almost complete annihilation. But having said that, so Anthony, how does this relate to your daemon eidolon dichotomy?
That's actually very perceptive of you, Miguel, because one of my next question that I was going to be asking here is that if you read Martin's book, what you'll find is that one of the most interesting elements of his writing for me was his experience of a being that he called the voice, something that guided him. And I'd be interested for Martin to tell us a little bit about this, because one of the things that joins the three of us is the concept of the daemon and the eidolon, in the sense that they are Gnostic concepts. The concepts I use quasi-neurologically, and I know, Martin, that you've experienced this kind of sense of a higher self, as it were. And I'd just like you to explain a little bit more about that and the background to those experiences and how they fit in overall to your overall hypothesis.
There's definitely a lot that I can say there, and I'm just really quickly trying to think of what we talked about last time. But I know this is a different audience and a different group, so it's okay if I repeat myself a little bit. But to get back to the idea of the voice, this was part of my process of coming to know myself in my true, authentic sense, and what I would describe as my genuine identity as this unitary consciousness. And again, going back to the idea that the ego develops this sense of self, and through altered states of consciousness, we're actually encountering these aspects of our ego and hopefully moving closer to our genuine sense of self. And kind of to go back to something that Miguel just said about how often this is experienced, this disintegration of the self is experienced very negatively by many people, in the sense that they feel that they're dying, and it's very fearful, and you don't want to let go, because the ego is trying to maintain itself, and so sometimes it needs to be radically deconstructed, and that can be a very extensive process for people. And that's very important to note, that sometimes people think, when they hear about, for example, for me, they hear about my experiences with 5-MeO DMT, and they think, oh, well, I want to try that because I want to have this complete unitary experience. I want to have this expanded sense of self. I want to have that unitary sense of absolute bliss and perfection. And an important thing to recognize is that most people have a great deal of attachments and projections that they need to work through before they can have that experience. So these molecular tools are just that. They're tools that help us along in this process. And by my estimates, they are the best tools that are available to individuals out there within reality. That they far surpass anything else that's available. But it doesn't make it automatic. It's not a mechanical process. And every individual has to go through releasing their own blocks, their own attachments, and their own projections before they can really get into the unitary sense of being. So to then get back to my own experience, I first encountered 5-MeO DMT at a time in my life that was very significant, in that I was completely ready for it. So without giving too many details, because it's a very long story, I had been married, and I had been with this woman since I was 18 years old, and we had 2 kids together, and we had been together for about 16 years or so. And within our relationship, we were very disconnected from each other, and we were very much shut down. There really wasn't any intimacy. There was no heart-to-heart connection between us. And I was very unhappy within that relationship, and I spent a lot of time blaming myself for the dysfunction of that relationship. So I had a very wounded sense of self, and I had also done a lot of things within that relationship that really compromised myself. And I did it out of a sense of spiritual obligation. I did it out of a sense of feeling that I needed to serve someone else. For example, our relationship was very shut down sexually, and I used that to try and convince myself, oh, this is just my ego. I need to transcend my desire to be intimate and have sex with my wife. And I need to transcend my desire to have a human attachment to her and to feel a sense of love, that this is all part of my spiritual process. The problem is that I was bullshitting myself, that I was just unhappy and I was shut down. And I wasn't allowing myself to either say what I really thought or do what I really thought. And so I was compromising all these aspects of myself. So events conspired, and that's a long story, so I won't get into that. But I ended up leaving my wife, and I left my job. I was working a job that I really was not happy with at all. This was down in Santa Barbara, California. I was working with really good people, but I didn't like the job at all. I was an academic advisor at an English language school for international students at the time. And it was very much a desk job, and it didn't suit me at all. I learned from that I don't enjoy being an administrator. So anyway, I left my wife, I left my job, and I ended up leaving my kids in that sense, who I have a very good relationship with today. I just want to emphasize that. But I ended up leaving Southern California, and I moved to Ashland, Oregon, where I am now. And so I was at a point in my life where I essentially left behind everything that was giving me stability, everything that was maintaining my sense of self, everything that was maintaining my sense of my reality. And I was in a very uncertain place. I didn't have a job. I had a very unstable living situation. And I was at this point where I was ready. And I also was acknowledging that I felt that I'd been holding myself back from something for my entire adult life, but I didn't know what it was. So it was very soon after this transition took place where I was kind of ready to find myself and find my life, where I connected with an individual here in Ashland who invited me to come over to his place and try 5-MeO DMT. So I was at this place where, if I were to describe it now, essentially I was ready to die, in a sense. I was ready to completely give up everything that I thought I was, because I had just admitted to myself, look, I've been profoundly unhappy in my life, and I don't know what's going to make me happy, and I don't know what I need to do, and I don't know where I'm going. So I went and I had this experience with 5-MeO DMT, and I had experimented with 5-MeO DMT before, but I had not received what I would call a full release dose. So I didn't really know what was possible. And I had worked with other entheogens prior to that. I'd worked with psilocybin mushrooms and salvia divinorum. But this first experience with 5-MeO DMT blew everything else away. It was just completely incomparable to anything I'd ever experienced. And the way that I described that first experience was that I felt within a matter of seconds of ingesting the 5-MeO DMT, it was in the chamber in a vaporizer, and I didn't even clear out the chamber, but I knew instantly, oh my God, this is it. Whatever it is, this is it. And the experience unfolded very rapidly, and I later described that as just complete unity with God at that point. And so the first, as the hit is coming on, I'm falling back onto this mattress, and I'm just calling out, thank you, God. Now, keep in mind, I had come from a Zen Buddhist kind of philosophical background, which Buddhism never talks about God, especially Zen Buddhism, not in any kind of sense that it's all this idea of no mind and pure consciousness. But my experience was, oh my God, it's God, that it's this living being of pure energy and pure love, and somehow it is everything within reality. And kind of integrating back from that experience, it was kind of hard for my ego to deal with, because for one, I said, thank you, God. And I had kind of identified myself as sort of an agnostic atheist or philosophical Buddhist or something, but here I am thanking God. So that was really unusual for me. And also within that experience, that it was a full non-dual experience. So it's not even accurate to say that I experienced God. What I experienced was myself as God. And my ego had a hard time with that, because if I'm God, well then who am I? What's going on here? It just completely defied all my expectations of what I thought was possible. So after that, I had another experience with 5-MeO DMT, and then what Anthony is asking about is that at that point I had entered into a new relationship with a woman here in Ashland, and that relationship dissolved. So then I was in between houses and places to live, still completely broke, trying to play child support. So everything was very uncertain for me. And I also felt completely heartbroken at that point. When I left my wife, I just felt liberated and ecstatic. But when this relationship dissolved, because my heart was really open and my heart was bleeding, and this relationship dissolved, and I just felt absolutely heartbroken. So a friend of mine, who I stayed with for a few days before I got a new place to live, suggested that I take some ecstasy, some MDMA, which I had never experienced before. And she said that, oh, this is very healing for the heart, so this will be great for you. And so I was very open. I said, sure, why not? So I took this ecstasy, and within really about 20 minutes, it started to open up energetically. And it felt to me as like, oh my God, this feels like the 5-MeO DMT and it's starting again. But still from that point, there was still more of my ego in play. So what started to unfold at that point is from the perspective of my ego, suddenly God started taking over my being and body. And then God started to talk to me through my body. And this was the most bizarre experience I had ever had in my life up until that point, where this voice is speaking through me, and my ego is observing all of this internally, saying, what in the hell is going on? Because this voice says, Martin, I love you. Your wounds have served you, but a time has come for you to set your pain aside. And it started talking in this really strange, deep voice with very different intonations from anything that I, Martin, would ever use. And this discourse went on for like 4 hours. And I didn't know what to make of that. My ego did not know what to make of it, because from my ego's perspective, it was, holy shit, God is talking to me through me. This is impossible. I must be crazy. Or maybe my ego is just going nuts. So I had all kinds of problems with that. But then over the next year or so, or a year and a few months, this started occurring more and more. Anytime I took any kind of entheogen, this voice would just start speaking. And it would say things like, I am you. I am the nature of all things. I am energy. I live through you. And it would be telling me all of these things. And my ego would always come back in afterwards and just say, what in the world is going on? And what eventually occurred is that distinction between my ego sense of self and this unitary sense of self, it eventually just dissolved, that boundary between the two, and also the boundary between taking psychedelics and not taking psychedelics. That boundary also dissolved to the point where I described myself as undergoing this sensation or experience as though I were taking 5-MeO DMT all the time, even though I wasn't. So I was naturally, endogenously producing this molecule. And in fact, my wife, that I'm now remarried, and so the woman that I was with at that time, who is now my wife, she said that she could actually smell it on my breath. She could smell it on my sweat, that I was just exuding this molecule somehow. And I was tripping very hard all the time. And what all that represents is that my ego was letting go more and more, and so this true sense of self was breaking through more and more and more, and it eventually reached the point where my ego just gave up and said, oh, okay, I guess that this other thing actually is me. And so as I described to Anthony last time, that now I wear my ego energetically as a social tool to facilitate dualistic interactions with other versions of the self. But I have no mistake about it. I know that it's not me. I know it's just a character that I'm playing through this individual, through this body. And I like to refer now to human bodies as vehicles, that they're God vehicles, highly actualized God vehicles. So what started as the sense of God is overtaking me or talking to me eventually just became, oh yeah, well that's actually me. That's the true nature of who and what I am. So for many people, they don't actually reach that point where they're able to identify thoroughly with what Anthony would refer to as the daemon, that is still seen as an exterior entity. So, for example, with shamanism and working with spirit helpers, that I would identify, those are aspects of yourself that are communicating to you that you're perceiving as other and as not you, but they're actually you. Or people who engage in things like channeling, that again is a projection of the ego that is misidentifying who's on the other end of the metaphysical telephone line there, that's actually you talking to yourself. And if you're lacking clarity, inner clarity about the true nature of yourself, you're going to tend to shape those experiences according to the desires and expectations of your ego, which is why the full non-dual unitary experience is so important, because that's when you have full recognition of the nature of the self. One way that I describe this is that in many altered states of consciousness, if you're experiencing other beings and entities in other realms, I kind of liken that to kind of thinking about Plato's cave. Kind of maybe you're seeing a puppet show, and you're thinking that you're interacting with these other entities. But the deeper knowledge is, well, this is actually a show. And then the deeper knowledge beyond that is, I'm actually the one who's manipulating these puppets. And I thought it was someone else manipulating these puppets, but it's actually me. And I'm the one who's putting on this show for myself. So everything that I'm experiencing here is actually a reflection of me. And when you can have that recognition, then the illusion dissolves. And then there's no more subject and there's no more object. There's just the nature of being that reveals itself.
Yeah, it reminds me of H.P. Blavatsky in the 19th century when she was hanging out with all the spiritualists, and they were talking about talking to the dead and my Aunt Petunia and this, and she would tell them, no, these are all just fragments of your Godhead. Or Carl Jung, who said that whenever you dream, everybody in your dream is simply a part of you.
Are there any areas, Martin, that you feel that our questions haven't really touched upon that you really would like to just for 5 or so minutes just tell us a little bit about in terms of your work and everything else? For instance, one of the things that we didn't get to chat with last time is your novel Beyond Azara as well, you know, and the way in which you're trying to fictionalize these experiences. So would you like to just tell us a little bit about that?
Thanks for asking about Beyond Azara. This is actually probably the most recent book that I've written. I haven't done a lot of writing over the past year. I've been busy doing art and other things. And now we have a new baby, so there's all kinds of things going on. But after writing my books, Being Human, and writing the Entheological Paradigm, and then I also released a couple e-books, shorter books along these lines, what I thought might be helpful for people is articulating these ideas in novel form. I really enjoy reading novels, and that's actually how I started writing back in 2002. I had come out of graduate school. I wasn't working in religious studies. I was working teaching English to international students, and I was really kind of dissatisfied with that. And I ended up reading Frank Herbert's Dune novels, and then I read all of Tolkien, reading Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and the Hobbit, and I read them in order, not in that order that I just named them. And when I finished Lord of the Rings, it was like 10 o'clock at night on a Tuesday, and I got this urge. I said, well, I want to write my own fantasy epic. And so then I did. I turned on my computer and I started writing a fantasy epic that became Tales of Arduin. So those were the first 4 books that I wrote. And actually my book Mushroom Wisdom comes out of the Tales of Arduin, and that I realized that I had put everything that I had learned from my experiences with psilocybin mushrooms, I had put into these novels. And I said, well, hey, how about if I extract that and write a book just about mushrooms? And so that's how I started writing specifically about entheogens, though entheogens definitely play a role in those novels. So I had written those books starting in 2002, and it took me about 3 years to write all 4 of those books and tell that story. And so I hadn't written any fiction in almost 10 years. And then last year, I felt that I wanted to, in a sense, tell my own personal story, but I wasn't quite ready to write an autobiography because I just had the urge that I wanted to write a fiction story, because I'd been reading all different kinds of novels and really wanted to get back into writing some fiction. So I wrote the story Beyond Azara, a universal love story. And it's completely a fantasy book. It's not, connected to the quote real world, in that it's a completely fantasy world and fantasy characters. But it also is very much, for me, a fictionalized spiritual autobiography. So I really have 3 main characters in the book. And one character, his name is Selak Surya. And he is representing me after going through my whole transition. So Selak is an individual who has accepted the fact that God is the only reality and that is him. And then there's 2 other characters of Gendru Amdrin and Jor Alesh Melva, this young man and young woman, who both represent me undergoing the process of discovering the true nature of the self. So I've created this fictionalized religion that's called Azara, which is kind of based of a combination of Tibetan Buddhism and Santo Daime and Catholicism. So it's a made-up religion, but they have a drink that they drink that I call Azara, and it's basically modeled off of ayahuasca in the book. And so the dramatic tension is all about how Gendru, who is this young man who's looking to become a monk in this religion of Azara, how he's being drawn away by this former ex-monk, Seylok, who is working with him with 5-MeO-DMT and kind of challenging all of his beliefs, all of his spiritual ideas, all of the doctrine that he's learned through his religion and through his ego, his sense of self, and all of that's being challenged within the book. And also, I wanted to create a novel that is really kind of reflective of the embodied nature of experience. So there's some aspects of the book that are very sexual, because that actually becomes very important as people undergo their process of getting in touch with all aspects of themselves. And kind of going back to something that Miguel was saying earlier about how Gnostics have been accused of being world renouncing. I mean, something that we see in a lot of, quote, mystical traditions is they talk about you have to overcome the temptations and desires of the body. And sometimes we see an emphasis on celibacy, which is something that I include in the novel in the Azara religion. But what I found is that embodied being and sensuality is actually really key to accepting all aspects of ourselves, because understanding that there's no genuine divide between self and other, it means that we are all things that we experience, including our sexuality, including our anger, including anything else. So it's about accepting and integrating all of that. And within the book, it really articulates what the 5-MeO-DMT experience is. It pretty much gives instructions on how one can use it to overcome their ego and enter into transcendent states, and then also guidelines for how to reorient yourself. And so that kind of gets back to your invitation, Anthony, to if there was anything else that I wanted to say about all this. And something that I think is very important, this is really one of the most fundamental issues related to the nature of the ego as an energetic construct and how we transcend the ego as an energetic construct. And this is definitely included in the novel Beyond Azara, is that what I've learned is that the ego tends to function at an energetic level, it tends to function asymmetrically in most instances. And something that I've learned is very key for working with entheogens is using symmetry in the body to help individuals overcome the way that their ego is constructing their sense of self and holding on to them energetically. Now, I first observed this in myself, where whenever I took 5-MeO-DMT and I would go into these unitary states of consciousness, my body would always function symmetrically, where my left and right sides would always mirror each other. And also, as this energy is flowing and overtaking me and this voice is speaking out of me, I would always gesture in these very fluid, symmetrical movements, and my left and right sides would never cross. So I might start like trying to sit in lotus posture, but my legs would immediately open up so that my limbs are not crossed. And it's kind of like as this energy is moving through my body and being, if you can kind of imagine a hose, when you turn on a hose and if you're not holding the end and it has a lot of pressure, that hose is just kind of flailing around wildly as all that energy is spurting out. Well, that's how my limbs would function. But the left and right sides would always mirror each other. And then I noticed that when the ego would start to reintegrate, that's when I would start to experience asymmetry in my body, where my left side might do something different than my right side. And then in observing other people, what I observed was that any person who went all the way into a unitary state of being, their bodies would start to move in these symmetrical patterns. This very distinct bilateral symmetry would occur. And then again, as their ego would reintegrate, suddenly they'd exhibit asymmetry in the body. Or if someone was undergoing a 5-MeO-DMT experience, but their ego was holding on, that almost always would take place asymmetrically. So someone might lie down and try and keep their body open and symmetrical, but if they're fighting, then they might turn to their left side and kind of grip on to something, or turn to their right side, or try and engage with something at a dualistic level of subject engaging with object. For example, when people get uncomfortable, they start thinking about, oh, I'm too cold, so maybe they reach for a blanket and they're breaking their symmetry, or they think I'm really thirsty and they reach for a glass of water, and that's at this very dualistic level at which this is occurring. And it's also the case that for most people, when they first experience this, when they go into these symmetrical states of being, their ego is completely gone. And when their ego reintegrates, you might ask them, what did you just experience? And they might say, I have no idea. Because their ego is not able to process that. And they're not able, you can even say, well, your body was just moving. Can you show me how your body was moving? And they can't reduplicate it. They can't show you. So it's something that you can learn over time. You can become more comfortable in that state to still maintain your awareness. But what all of this has taught me is that in working with entheogens, symmetry in the body becomes a way that if you can focus on being symmetrical, and even when your ego is urging you to move to the left or move to the right or engage in asymmetrical movements, and this even applies to your eyesight, keeping your eyesight kind of focused along a center line, that when you do that, you make it much more likely that you are able to enter into a full non-dual state of being where your energy is fully open and fully extended. And also for many individuals, in order to reach that level where you can maintain that symmetry, because the ego tends to inhibit our natural energy, what it does is it creates energetic blocks, generally along the central line of the body where these two symmetrical sides meet. And most people also hold on to knots of energy in their abdomen, because this is the most vulnerable parts of our bodies. So for a lot of people, in working with symmetry, that they find that they're terribly uncomfortable because there's all these energetic knots in their being that are trying to make them be asymmetrical. So if you can focus on staying symmetrical, those knots start to unwind and release. And then this is when people tend to purge, they throw up, they vomit, they sometimes foam mucus out of their mouth. Sometimes people even have orgasms as all of this is releasing. And then they enter into this full symmetrical state where it's kind of like the body is making love with the universe. Because really, love is the only energy that actually exists, and everything is just a refraction of that one unitary energy. So when people go into this state, it's as though they're making love with themselves in the form of the universe and their body. So people actually look like they're making love, and that's how their bodies operate and function. And I've found that this is so key, that this is the one thing that when people ask me, well, how do I use entheogens to, get into unitary states of being? And the number one key that I tell them, besides relax, surrender, trust, and just let go, is maintain symmetry in your body. And if you move out of symmetry, bring yourself back into symmetry, and that's what's going to actually help you move beyond your ego and fully embody your infinite self, your infinite expansion of energy. And it's such an important key, and it's something that I've never seen anybody else talk about. I've never heard anyone mention that symmetry is important. And so that's one of the primary keys that I like to tell people is practice symmetry. And then you can apply that to any situation in your life at any moment, at any time, because your own energy in your body is always a reflection of your internal state. So if you're able to face things head on, if you're able to face things with an open body posture and stance, you're going to be much more centered in your energy and much more centered in genuine reality rather than your attachments and your projections of your ego. So it's absolutely key.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating, Martin. That was really intriguing. There's so many things spinning around in my mind now about questions I need to subsequently ask you.
Me too.
Great.
This is great. In fact, I can really relate to so much of you said in life, Lord of the Rings, all that. There's too many parallels for another time. But for the more, let's say, historically oriented, certain scholars like Chris Bennett and Lawrence Carana have proposed these ideas, and I wanted you to give us your take. But what evidence do we have that, let's say, the Gnostics, the Christians and Jews from those times in the Levant, first century and before, took entheogens?
Well, this is kind of one of these historical gray areas where, as far as I know, I don't think we have any definitive proof that they're working with entheogens. However, there is a lot of evidence that seems to suggest that. I mean, even when we're dealing with the basic Genesis story of there's this strange tree in the Garden of Eden that somehow contains the knowledge of good and evil, and if you eat it, it's going to open your eyes in some capacity. And so a lot of people have identified this as most likely referencing some kind of entheogen. And we certainly know that among the Gnostics that there's a great deal of emphasis, like we see in Buddhism, that there's this false sense of self, and then there's this genuine self that somehow is covered over through ignorance. And so we definitely know that there's a very different orientation among the Gnostics than, say, among Catholic Christians, where the idea is that Jesus is presenting a model for self-discovery, that he is a spiritual model more than he is some kind of metaphysical savior that's going to save you from your sins, that he's presenting the model of how to discover the true nature of the self. And so sometimes this is called like Christ consciousness. What we also have is a lot of very curious artistic renderings in the Christian tradition, especially coming out of southern France, that seems to show the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden as being an Amanita muscara mushroom. And so there are a variety of different images that are presenting mushrooms, and also within Christian art, there are many curious instances of either literal mushrooms being depicted or symbolic references to Amanita mushrooms. So there's lots of very interesting evidence there, but I don't think that we've found anything necessarily completely conclusive on that. But given that some things that we do know is that in the Greek mystery cults, they were ingesting some kind of psychedelic that they called kykeon, or some kind of psychotropic. We don't know for certain if it actually was a psychedelic. The problem with these esoteric groups is that they keep this stuff super secret. And that's part of the initiation, is that you're initiated into these secret societies. And part of the agreement is that you not reveal what the sacrament is. So there's no written record of that. Like even in reading Plato, there's a dialogue where Socrates, I believe, is talking about how, oh yeah, someone down the street has actually gotten in trouble with the authorities because he's having mystery parties at his house, and he's giving out this sacrament that they're giving at the mystery cult temples in ancient Greece, and he's doing it at his house. And so there's some interesting evidence there, again, that it's some kind of psychedelic. We do know that in Hinduism, there's absolute conclusive evidence that there's use of various psychedelics within that tradition, and that's involved in the esoteric side, the more mystical side of Hinduism. And then we can also see that that was most likely taking place in Zoroastrianism as well, where they talk about hwama, whereas in Hinduism it was called soma, but it's basically the same kind of idea, the same thing. So there's lots of instances in the ancient world in those various religions and mystery cults where they were consuming some kind of psychedelic. So it actually seems rather unlikely that early Christian Gnostics would have picked up a mystery cult style without also using mystery cult sacraments as well. So there's a lot of things that suggest that would not be unusual at all for them to be taking some kind of psychedelic. But I don't think that there's been any definitive archaeological evidence found that can really pinpoint that. I mean, this kind of thinking really started to emerge with John Marco Allegro when he was translating. He was one of the original translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and his analysis was that the figure of Jesus, or the teacher of righteousness, was really a symbolic representation of a few different things, of mushrooms and fertility cults, an image of the penis, and also the zodiac and astrology. And we tend to see these kinds of themes go together in various esoteric cults and societies. The idea of mushrooms and penises are being related together because they kind of look rather similar. I mean, we see this in Hinduism with mushrooms being called the phallus of Shiva or the lingam. And then also with astrology, the notion that there is this connection between the cosmos and the individual, and that these cycles of energy that regulate the cosmos are also reflected in the individual, the microcosm and the macrocosm. But I still think that it's something that's open to debate, and it's open to a lot more research. I mean, as we've become aware in modern society of the role of entheogens within religion. I mean, these are still things that are not widely known by a lot of people. That I teach religious studies here in Ashland at the university, and I spend a lot of time talking about these issues in class. And sometimes my students are really kind of shocked that, because they think, well, what do, quote, drugs have to do with religion? And when you tell them that, well, actually, there's a variety of different traditions that make use of these things, and these tend to be the more mystical side of these traditions, the more esoteric side, that just people don't know that. I mean, people think about, oh yeah, Rastafarians, they smoke pots, and that's a religion that's connected with, quote, drugs. But they don't know about all these other historical connections. And everybody knows Greek mythology, but most people don't know that the mystery cults operated for some 2,000 years, where they were initiating people with some kind of psychedelic within these rituals, and that these myths are actually stories that were enacted within these rituals of going down into the underworld and then consuming the food there, and then being able to gain new life and kind of this rebirth experience. That these are all symbolic renderings of the psychedelic experience. And so this is just knowledge that's not generally known. But as more people learn about it, there's more research being done in this area. So I really think it's an area that requires a lot more research. And the more we look for it, I think the more we're able to find that the idea that in many religions, they talk about these magical foods. Well, what are they talking about? What are they talking about that somehow gives you insight and knowledge? That it seems very likely that they're probably talking about some kind of psychedelic substance or some kind of mind-altering substance. And I think it's just undeniable that it's been a fundamental part of human spirituality and religiosity, and it's often a hidden part of culture that's just been communicated through small societies that have done a very good job of maintaining their secrets, but they've left a great deal of clues for us to examine.
Congratulations on the mess you made of things. I'm trying to reconstruct the air and all that brings. And oxidation is the compromise you own. But this is beginning to feel like the dog wants a bone.